It's such a pleasure to be here, as always. I do a lot of speaking presentations for Rotary, and I always really enjoy myself. They feel like a holiday. I enjoy the Rotarians, the fellowship, and the locations, and this is no exception. My involvement with Rotary is of more than 10 years duration now. I was an Ian Scott Fellow, so Australian Rotary Health funded my PhD, which I started at the end of 2004, beginning of 2005. And it was to undertake research in an area that had not previously been investigated. And I was really lucky, I think, in that I had an idea just at the right time that has found real traction, and now we have a whole field of research that didn't exist before. But really, I don't think it would have happened without the support of Rotary. So I want to talk to you about it today. I'll put it into a context, I'll lead you through some of the findings and also talk about what we're doing next and Rotary's involvement. But this is something that I think most people are interested in, because everybody is affected by mental health, whether it's personally or in the family or community, people with mental disorders, mental health problems. It's highly disabling, very common. But of course we also all eat, and a lot of people, myself included, are a bit obsessed with diet and, you know, the questions around what we should eat, etc. So bringing these two things together has been my job for the last few years. So I'll start off by putting my talk into a context. This is the context. You know, none of us is getting any thinner. And the real driving force between what we all recognise now as the obesity epidemic since the 1980s has been really profound changes to our food system, where we've moved away from traditional and healthier dietary patterns to dietary patterns that have far more processed foods and higher energy density foods, but less nutrients. We've seen that obesity epidemic first develop in the West, in Australia and New Zealand and Britain and the US, but now it's really right across the globe. So we're seeing really rapid increases in obesity in developing countries, places such as India and China and South America, massive increases in obesity prevalence just in one generation. And along with that, of course, come a really enormous increase in the prevalence of what we call the NCDs, the non-communicable disorders, and the heart disease and diabetes, metabolic syndrome, etc. Now, as I mentioned, it's changes in our food system that have primarily, we think, prompted this increase in obesity and certainly contributed to the huge global burden of the NCDs, which are expected to cost the global community upwards of $30 trillion over the next 15 years. And the WHO have made the point that there's no country and no economy in the world that can afford this. You know, we can't afford the healthcare costs that are imposed by our lifestyle-mediated diseases. So this is just one graph, and I mean, I could show you 100 that look very similar. This is from The Economist. And what it really does is it tells us about the changes, very general level, since the 1970s. So the line up the top that's going downwards is the intake, consumption and purchasing of fresh green vegetables, whereas the ready-made and convenience meals and pizzas and chips are down the bottom and going up. This is, of course, quite at odds with how we used to eat, and particularly, you know, when we were genetically developing over the Stone Age and up until about 10,000 years ago when we started to settle down and develop agriculture, we had a lot more nutrients, a lot more wild plant foods, something like 10 times as many different varieties of plant foods that we used to consume. Very good quality lean meat and fish, and nuts and seeds, etc. But of course we also didn't have added sugars and alcohol and added salts and those sorts of foods. So our diets are markedly different to what we are nominally designed to eat. And this has been part of the problem in terms of our modern lifestyle-mediated diseases. So I'm going to talk today a lot about dietary patterns, and when we, a lot of the original research in nutrition, going back 20, 30 years, focused on individual nutrients. You know, what was the risk associated with not having enough B group vitamins or zinc or something like that. But of course we don't eat just individual nutrients or vitamins. We eat whole diets, and the way that those nutrients and vitamins and minerals and fibre, etc., interact in our foods together is really complex. We don't even begin to understand it, and that interaction is very important. So it's much better to look at overall dietary patterns. There's a few ways of doing that, which I won't bore you with because they involve statistics. But one of the important things to understand is that these two types of dietary patterns, a healthy dietary pattern and an unhealthy dietary pattern, when we do the research, they're not just the opposite of each other. So, for example, young people are often quite high on both of these dietary patterns. So they're getting a lot of healthy food at home, but then on the weekends and after school, they're going and having a whole lot of takeaway and chips, etc. So they can be high on both of these dietary patterns. Equally, people can be low on each of these dietary patterns. So particularly a lot of older people, they're not eating a lot of KFC and Macca's and takeaway foods, but neither are they having a diet that has a lot of the nutrient-dense foods. They're having a very limited range of foods. They're not just the opposite of each other, and they're both independently related to health outcomes. So where you sit on each of these dietary patterns plays a big part in predicting the risk for cardiovascular disease, stroke, obesity, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, many forms of cancer, and now we're increasingly understanding also dementia and cognitive decline. And in fact, the research in this field is really suggesting that one of the main things that predicts our risk for dementia in older age is what we do at the start of our life, what we do in the first 30 odd years in terms of our diet, exercise, smoking, which is a little bit depressing, really. That's not to say that you can't modify that risk over the lifespan by making healthier choices. But it is interesting that the research in dementia is really tracking along with what we're doing in common mental disorders. So today when I talk about mental health, I'm not going to be talking about the serious disorders such as schizophrenia. I'm focusing on what we call the common mental disorders, depression and anxiety. Now, mental and substance use disorders actually account for the largest burden of disability across the globe, more than any other sort of illness. And the very large bulk of that burden is made up of this blue section here is depression, and this is anxiety disorders. So they really impose a huge burden of disability, and they're highly prevalent. So I'm going to talk a bit about data that we collected from a large randomly selected sample of women in the Geelong area, right across the age range from 20s right up until their 90s, very representative of the Australian female population. When they came in for one of the assessments that they do as part of a big ongoing osteoporosis study, we actually administered a clinical interview to assess their current and lifetime mental health status. And what we found was that more than a third of women had had a clinically significant depressive or an anxiety disorder at some point in their life. 15% of women were affected at the time of the interview. And this is not just a few days of feeling down, this is a clinically significant disorder. Now, this is pretty much what we see in every population when they're assessed properly. So again, these disorders are extremely common and really can be viewed in many cases as part of life, but we believe that there's certain things that you can do to increase or decrease your risk of these disorders. So my PhD, when I first came into mental health research, I was really interested to realise that no one had actually looked at diet and mental health. You know, in the rest of medicine, we knew that diet was very important for health, but in mental health, which is very much informed by this Cartesian idea of the mind-body dichotomy, mind and body being separate. But we're increasingly understanding that that's not true, and particularly for depression, that depression is very much a manifestation of immune dysfunction and a lot of other underlying pathophysiological, biological changes that can give rise to depression. And many of those things are in turn influenced by diet and nutrition. So my PhD, supported by Australian Rotary Health, investigated this relationship between diet and habits, dietary habits, and mental health in that large population of women that I talked about. And the result of the PhD was published on the front cover of the American Journal of Psychiatry, and this is one of the leading psychiatry journals in the world. So it's had a really big influence on the field. And as I point out, it wouldn't have happened without Australian Rotary Health. So I'm going to give you just a bit of a snapshot of what we found in that study and then talk about some of the other work that we've done since. So in that study, we found women who were higher on this Western unhealthy dietary pattern were much more likely to have depression. Okay? Women who had what we called a traditional healthy dietary pattern, a bit like meat and 3 veg, so lean meats, fish, whole grain and lots of fruits and vegetables, they were much less likely to have either a depressive disorder or an anxiety disorder. And of course, with these studies, we take into account a whole range of other things that could explain that relationship, such as women's income or socioeconomic status, education, other health behaviours, etc. These didn't explain this finding. So this was very interesting. As I said, it made a big splash in the psychiatry research field and amongst clinicians. We went on to Norway, where they do a lot of fantastic research. And I wanted to know whether those same relationships existed in a different culture and a different population with different dietary habits. And we looked at men and women in this study and found pretty much the same thing. People who had healthier diets were less likely to be depressed. People who had unhealthier diets were more likely to be anxious, and for the women, they were also more likely to have depression. Again, quite independent of all these other factors we took into account. In Britain at about the same time, there was a big study called the Whitehall 2 cohort study, and people who are close colleagues of mine now looked at this over time in about 3,500 British public servants, and they found that people who had a healthier diet were much less likely to develop new depression, where they hadn't had it before, over about 5 years. Those with an unhealthier diet were much more at risk. Again, this wasn't explained by other potential explanatory factors. And even in Japan, where they have very different diets to us, still within Japan you will see variance in the healthiness or otherwise of people's diets. And colleagues of mine there, and I've done quite a bit of work with this group now over in Japan, they've showed again that a healthier Japanese diet protects against depression, but it also protects against suicide. This is a country that's very much affected culturally by suicide. And people who had a healthier diet were half as likely to commit suicide. Even in Spain, people who have more of an adherence to a healthy Mediterranean-style diet, much less likely to develop depression over time. So all of these studies were saying the same thing. Diet and nutrients are not just relevant for your physical health, but also to your risk for mental health problems. But the key thing about these common mental disorders is that they have a very early age of onset. And in fact, half of all mental disorders start before the age of 14 years, 3/4 by 25. So if we're thinking about prevention, which is what I'm very interested in, then we need to be thinking earlier in the lifespan. And the average age of onset for depression is in fact around puberty. It's about 12, 13 years old, particularly for girls. So we looked at this in young people. Was this also true? One of the reasons we wanted to do this as well is because despite all of the energy and attention that's been given to mental health and mental illness over the last 10 years or so, there's still evidence that it's getting worse, particularly in young people. So these are data from Britain. There's data from America that looks quite similar, and even some from Australia that suggests that things are actually getting worse for young people. So in this particular study, they looked at the percentage of young people reporting frequent feelings of anxiety or depression in 1986 compared to 20 years later in 2006. This is in boys and in girls, and you can see that those rates have doubled in that time. Now, as I said, similar data from America and some suggestive data from Australia suggesting that that's true as well, which is of course quite concordant with the increases in obesity that we've seen over that time frame. So we did a study with the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, where I'm based most of the time. We looked at about 3,500 young people from right around Australia, lots of different areas, socio-demographic areas, and we found those with healthier diets had better mental health. They were much less likely to be depressed. The ones who had unhealthier junk food diets, guess what? They were much more likely to be depressed. And in this study, we could take into account things such as family conflict and poor family management, physical activity, etc., other factors that could have explained this relationship. They didn't explain it. We went on and did another study, a prospective study, where we followed kids over time, over 2 years. And we found the same thing. Healthier diets predicted better mental health at the start and also 2 years later. Unhealthy diets, the opposite. Importantly too, kids whose diets improved over that 2-year period that we followed them, their mental health also improved. The kids whose diets got worse, their mental health got worse. So these were really important because they're the first studies to show that it's also relevant for adolescents, average age of onset in that age group. So since then, so that was in 2010, my PhD study was published, and we've had a plethora of data published from right across the world, all different countries, continents, age groups, cultures, showing very similar things. This is something that didn't exist knowledge-wise before then. But what we didn't know up until about a year or so ago was whether this was true right at the beginning of the lifespan. So there's something called the Barker hypothesis, and we've known since probably the 1980s that early life nutrition, particularly in utero, the sort of food that you get when you're developing, is linked to your risk for heart disease and other metabolic disorders much later on in your adult life. But we didn't know whether this is true for mental health. I was luckily supported by a big philanthropic group in the US to go again to Norway to investigate the possible contribution of early life nutrition to mental health problems in children. And in fact, the average age of onset for anxiety disorders is only 6 years old. So we really want to go back and think, okay, what's happening in development, the developing brain, the developing immune system that feeds into the risk for mental health problems in children? So we were able to look at 23,000 mothers and their children. And we looked at the children's behaviours, externalising behaviours, their symptoms, tantrums, aggression, those externalising behaviours, internalising sadness, worry, crying, nightmares, those sorts of things. These are really key indicators in children of vulnerability to mental health problems. And we looked at mum's diet during pregnancy and then the children's diet in the first few years. And we followed the children from 18 months to 5 years and looked at these behaviours. And of course, we took into account a whole range of other things that could explain that. And what we found was that mums who had more junk food during pregnancy, independent of all the other things we took into account, the kids consistently had higher levels of these externalising behaviours. And then quite independent of that, the kids' diet was important as well. So the kids who had healthier diets, they had much lower levels of these internalising and externalising behaviours. And then quite independently, if they had more junk processed foods, they had higher levels of these behaviours. And what's really key is that 2 other big studies have now confirmed those findings. And they're also very much in accordance with what we know from animal experimental studies, where you feed pregnant animals a junk food diet and then look at what happens to the brain development and other outcomes in the offspring. Now, why is this relevant? Well, these are data from Australia. These are published in the Medical Journal of Australia a couple of years ago. A randomly selected, very representative sample of South Australian toddlers, 3 and 4 years old. Less than 20% of them were getting enough dietary fibre. Now, fibre is absolutely key to the health of the gut and the gut microbiota, which in turn is critical for brain development and for the development and the functioning of the immune system. Less than a third were getting enough of the omega-3 fatty acids we know are so important for brain development. Nearly all of them were getting too much saturated fat, and terrifying, 31% of them were already overweight or obese. They're only 3 and 4 years old. And these aren't particularly special kids, they're just random selection of the population. So what we're finding, and this is another very important understanding, this is another Australian study. They looked at over nearly 4,500 students from right around Australia. They wanted to know whether kids from poorer backgrounds were fatter. They thought that they would be, and indeed they were. What they didn't expect to find was that they were also shorter. So they're stunted in their growth. And this is evidence of what we call malnubesity. It's when you're getting too much energy but not enough nutrition. So this is not just a certain segment of the population, this is the whole population. And in fact, only 10% of us across the country adhere to the National Healthy Eating Guidelines. So this is not just about poor people or uneducated people, this affects all of us. The activities of the food industry, globalisation of the food industry. You can't even fill up your car with petrol these days without being bombarded with a huge array of unhealthy food products. It's both compelling and daunting to consider that dietary intervention at an individual or population level could reduce rates of psychiatric disorders. This was from the editorial that went with our paper. So for the first time, we can start thinking, okay, prevention, if we can modify and improve diet, do you think we can prevent and treat mental disorders? Well, one of those parts of the question we're attempting to find out. So this is a study that's still underway. We're running the very first randomised controlled trial to try to answer that question. Well, I'm already depressed. If I improve my diet, will I feel better? And we think, well, possibly, but we don't know. We need to do the scientific study to find out. We're funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council to run this trial, and we will hopefully have the results of this by the end of the year. This has received a huge amount of interest across the world, features on the BBC, Washington Post, all sorts of things, because it's the first time we've tried to answer that question. This is a really important caveat. You can't just take a whole stack of supplements, vitamin pills, and continue to eat this and expect that it will all turn out okay. They're not equivalent and it doesn't work. It would be really nice if it was that easy, but it doesn't work. Okay, so at the end of 2012, beginning of 2013, aware of the real need to drive research forward in this field, I founded the International Society for Nutritional Psychiatry Research. Now that has now approximately 200 members, academic researchers from all over the world who are really interested in this but haven't previously been brought together, previously doing their own little thing in their own small area. Now we talk to each other, we collaborate, we hold international meetings, and we're starting to get some really good traction in the field. And indeed, this was just published in January. Lancet Psychiatry, one of the leading journals in the world, they published our position statement, Nutritional Medicine as Mainstream in Psychiatry. Nutritional medicine should now be considered as a mainstream element of psychiatric practice, with research, education, policy and health promotion supporting this new framework. So it's really saying that physical and mental health are one. The fuel that you put into your body, that's the substrate. You don't go putting dirty, watered down petrol into a Porsche. You've got to think about what goes into your body because it really matters, not just to your physical health, but also to your mental health. So the WHO has long known that your mental health really contributes to your physical health. And we're starting to understand how that actually works now. It appears that when you're stressed, it changes the gut microbiota. These little bugs that live in your gut, that's your second brain. And they are changed very rapidly in response to medications, such as antibiotics, obviously, diet, physical activity and stress. And when they change, they have a very rapid and profound impact on the immune system. So now what we're saying, the opposite's also true. Your physical health really matters to your mental health, because when those gut microbiota change, when your immune system changes as a response to unhealthy diets, etc., it flows on to your risk for mental disorder as well. And that gives us opportunities to think about prevention. And indeed, there's been 2 big prevention trials, early ones suggesting that you can prevent mental disorders and depression by improving diet. And last year, I was extremely jealous to hear this, but I went and spoke to them over in Amsterdam. A large European consortium has just been awarded €9 million to investigate this in a large European trial. Now, the key thing is that none of this really would have kicked off without Rotary's support. And Rotary, Australian Rotary Health, are absolutely central to mental health research in Australia, because even though mental disorders account for the largest burden of disability in Australia and across the globe, they receive far less of the research budget. I haven't received funding for 2 years. My funding, when I go up against other people in medical science, it goes to cancer and it goes to heart disease. They're the things that people see and, you know, they get the bulk of the funding. Rotary has long realised this and has therefore supported mental health research in Australia. At the moment, medical research in Australia is at crisis point. In our universities, we are 33rd out of 34 OECD countries in terms of the amount of public funding going into universities. Second last. Medical research funding is at the lowest level since the 1970s. So we're seeing scores of people like me leaving the country because there's nowhere to go, there's nowhere to get funding for our research. We got knocked back for a funding application to Bupa last week, and they said we had funding for 5 projects. We had over 600 applicants. It's less than 1% success rate. Australian Rotary Health is absolutely central. They're supporting us, they're supporting our research. So I'm president of the Alliance for the Prevention of Mental Disorders in Australia. We represent over 250 researchers and representatives of mental health NGOs, organisations. We held our first conference at the end of last year in Adelaide with support from Australian Rotary Health, because now we know there's lots of things that we can do to actually prevent disorders. If we focus particularly on the early years, we think that we can actually avert a lot of these disorders starting in the first place, and that's a much better investment. So thank you so much, and thank you to Rotary for all your support, and thanks for having me.